in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, behind climate-controlled glass and accessible only to researchers with specific credentials, lies a single sheet of vellum measuring 62 centimeters by 48 centimeters. The parchment has yellowed to the color of weak tea, its edges brittle, its surface crossed by fold lines that have become permanent scars in the material. Drawn upon it in faded brown ink is a coastline that should not exist. A coastline that was supposedly discovered by James Cook in 1770, yet here it sits, rendered in remarkable detail, dated 1644, signed by a cartographer working in the service of the Dutch East India Company 126 years before the Endeavour ever left Plymouth. The western coast of what we now call Australia appears on this chart with its major bays correctly positioned, its peninsulas properly angled, its dangerous shoals marked with small crosses that correspond to locations where shipwrecks would later occur, demonstrating the accuracy of the charted hazards rather than any impossible foreknowledge. The anomaly is not that the Dutch mapped parts of Australia before the British. Everyone accepts that. The anomaly is the precision, the specific, inexplicable precision of features the Dutch could not have surveyed with the technology and time they officially possessed. The official explanation for this map, and for the dozens of similar Dutch charts from the same period, is straightforward and well documented. The Dutch East India Company, known by its initials VOC, dominated trade routes to the Spice Islands throughout the 17th century, and their ships, sailing from the Cape of Good Hope toward Java, discovered that the fastest route involved riding the Roaring Forties, the powerful westerly winds between latitudes 40 and 50 degrees south, before turning north toward their destination. This route brought them dangerously close to the western coast of an unknown landmass, which they called New Holland. And over the course of several decades, from Dirk Hartog's landing in 1616 to Abel Tasman's circumnavigation in 1642 to 1644, Dutch navigators compiled enough coastal observations to produce increasingly accurate charts. The explanation is sensible. The explanation accounts for Dutch presence in these waters. The explanation does not account for what appears on the charts themselves. The interior details, the depth soundings in locations no Dutch ship is recorded as having entered, the annotations describing seasonal variations in wind patterns that would require years of observation to compile, the features that match modern satellite imaging with an accuracy that simple coastal sailing could never produce. Consider the Shark Bay Peninsula, that distinctive double-pronged formation on the western coast, roughly 800 kilometers north of what is now Perth. On the 1644 chart, its shape is rendered with such fidelity that when modern researchers overlay the historical drawing onto satellite photographs, the correlation coefficient exceeds 94%. The official explanation holds that Dirk Hartog landed on the island at the peninsula's tip in 1616, and that subsequent Dutch vessels made additional observations over the following decades. This explanation requires that navigators, making brief coastal passes in ships that could not safely approach shore, somehow captured the precise angles of two parallel peninsulas extending over 100 kilometers into the sea, correctly plotted the narrow strait between them, and accurately depicted the interior bay system that is not visible from most offshore vantage points accessible to sailing vessels of that era. The Dutch left no records of extended surveys in this region. No Dutch expedition is documented as having spent more than a few days in any single location along the western coast. Yet the map shows what only sustained systematic surveying could reveal. But this was only the surface of a much deeper pattern. The through line that connects every anomaly in these charts is a specific and recurring shape. The precise outline of coastlines that should have appeared as rough approximations, but instead display the kind of accuracy that would not become standard in European cartography until the development of marine chronometers in the late 18th century. Longitude was the unsolvable problem of 17th century navigation. Without an accurate shipboard clock, sailors could not determine their east-west position with any reliability, and errors of several hundred kilometers were common even in the Mediterranean, a sea that Europeans had sailed for 3,000 years. The Dutch charts of Western Australia show longitudinal accuracy within approximately 30 kilometers, not perfect by modern standards, but extraordinary, almost impossible, for their era. The shape that keeps appearing is not a single bay or peninsula, but this very accuracy itself, this ghost outline that matches the real coast as if traced from above, as if copied from something the Dutch should not have possessed. The following fact changes everything about how we must interpret these documents. In 1957, a retired Portuguese naval officer named Armando Cortesão published a facsimile of a chart he had discovered in the archives of the French National Library. The document, which became known as the Dieppe maps after the Norman school of cartographers who produced them, included several charts dated between 1536 and 1566, a full 80 years before Dirk Hartog's supposedly first European landing on Australian shores. One of these charts, attributed to a cartographer named Jean Rots and dated 1542, shows a landmass labelled Javet-le-Grand, positioned exactly where Australia sits, extending from the tropics to well below latitude 40 south. The eastern coastline on this chart includes features that correlate, controversially but measurably, with the Great Australian Bight, with Spencer Gulf, with the distinctive triangular shape of what is now Tasmania. The western coastline matches the Dutch charts that would not be drawn for another century. The official position on the Dieppe maps is that they represent either a gross geographical error, perhaps a distorted depiction of Java or Sumatra, or a deliberate Portuguese falsification designed to claim territories under the terms of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Neither explanation addresses why the errors would so consistently match a real coastline on the opposite side of the world, a coastline no European is recorded as having seen. We call them discoveries. We call them first contacts, first landings, first surveys. We call them the origins of European knowledge about this continent. What the Mitchell Library vellum and the Dieppe charts suggest, when examined together rather than in isolation, is that they were copies, careful copies of source materials that have either been lost, destroyed, or deliberately suppressed. Maps of a coastline that someone had already mapped. Charts that transmitted inherited knowledge rather than original observation. Before you dismiss that interpretation as conspiratorial romanticism, follow the specific evidence. Not the theory, the evidence. The accuracy problem has never been resolved by mainstream scholarship, merely set aside. In 1977, a researcher named Kenneth McIntyre published a comprehensive study titled The Secret Discovery of Australia, in which he compiled over 300 individual features from the Dieppe maps and correlated them with modern geography. His methodology was straightforward if labor-intensive. He identified every bay, peninsula, river mouth, and coastal angle on the 16th century charts, then measured the degree to which each feature matched the actual Australian coastline when adjusted for the systematic distortions that all maps of that era contained. His conclusion, rejected by academic consensus but never methodologically refuted, was that the correlation exceeded random chance by a factor that could not be explained by coincidence or error. The map makers of Dieppe had access to detailed information about a coastline that, according to official history, no European had yet approached. The outline, that specific accurate outline, kept appearing in documents that should have contained only speculation and blank space. None of the official versions explain what comes next. The Dutch East India Company was, above all else, a commercial enterprise, and its commercial success depended absolutely on the secrecy of its navigation charts. VOC captains were forbidden under penalty of imprisonment from sharing route information with outsiders, and all charts were technically company property, to be surrendered at the end of each voyage for secure storage in Amsterdam. Yet the 1644 chart in Sydney, along with its companion documents scattered across European archives, shows evidence of multiple hands, annotations in different inks, corrections that suggest comparison with other sources, marginal notes that reference observations made decades apart. The company that guarded its navigation secrets with paranoid intensity somehow produced charts that synthesized information from sources no company records acknowledge. The outline appears consistent across documents that should have developed independently, as if all of them were working from the same template, the same original that no one has ever located, the same map that does not officially exist. Consider what this means before you dismiss it as archival error, as retroactive interpolation, as the kind of pattern matching that finds faces in clouds. Follow the specific evidence, not the theory. The evidence. The Rots Atlas of 1542, held now at the British Library, contains a chart attributed to the French cartographer Jean Rots, who worked for Henry VIII. The official explanation is straightforward. Rots compiled Portuguese sources, added decorative flourishes, and the resulting coastline represents the Dieppe school's speculative geography, fragments of rumour dressed in the authority of measurement. The chart shows a landmass labelled Java la Grande, extending southward from the Indonesian archipelago, and most historians treat it as Java itself, distorted by projection error, or as a conflation of multiple smaller islands that Rots assembled into a single imaginary continent. That is the institutional position. But the outline of Java la Grande, when overlaid on modern Australia at the same latitude, matches the indentation of Shark Bay with a deviation of 14 nautical miles. 14 nautical miles. Rots was working 228 years before Cook's expedition, 64 years before the first documented Dutch landing at the Eendracht encounter point, and his bay curves inward at precisely the angle where the Peron Peninsula meets the mainland. The official explanation does not account for how a speculative conflation of rumours produced a specific coastal feature at the correct latitude, with an accuracy that would have required someone to stand at the shore and measure it. The Dauphin map, dated to approximately 1536 and held at the Morgan Library in New York, presents the same problem from a different angle. French scholars attribute it to the same Dieppe school, the same network of Norman cartographers who supposedly never left European waters, but somehow synthesized Portuguese intelligence into decorative charts for aristocratic patrons. The Dauphin map shows a southern landmass with a distinctive shape at its southwestern corner, a bulge that corresponds to no known Indonesian island but aligns, when projected, onto the same coordinate system used by Portuguese navigators of the period, with the Cape Leeuwin region of Western Australia. That bulge appears on Dutch charts from 1627 onward, after Francois Thijssen mapped the southern coast in the Gulden Zeepaert, but it appears on the Dauphin map 91 years earlier. The official explanation requires either that two separate cartographic traditions invented the same imaginary shape independently, or that both were copying from a common source that predated them both. Neither option closes the question. Neither option explains how the shape appeared at the correct position relative to landmarks that would not receive European names for another century. But this is only the French evidence. The next layer changes everything. The anonymous Valad Atlas of 1547, also from the Dieppe school, contains the most troubling chart of all. It depicts the eastern coast of Jave-la-Grande with river mouths, harbours, and what appear to be notations for depths, the kind of practical detail that distinguishes a working navigation chart from a decorative wall map. Historians dismiss these details as artistic embellishment, as the cartographer filling empty space with conventional symbols that carried no empirical content. But the Valad Atlas shows a harbour at a latitude that corresponds within 8 nautical miles to Botany Bay. Cook named Botany Bay in 1770. The Valad Atlas predates Cook by 223 years. The harbour symbol on the Valad chart is not a generic flourish applied randomly across the coastline. It appears at one specific location, surrounded by a curve of land that matches the headlands Banks and Solander would describe in their journals as unprecedented, as shapes they had never seen documented in any prior European chart. The official explanation requires that a French decorative cartographer working from vague Portuguese rumours in a Norman workshop placed a harbour symbol at random and happened, by pure chance, to position it at one of the 3 best natural harbours on the eastern Australian seaboard. That outline appears again on the Valad chart. The same proportions, the same strange specificity in a document that should contain only speculation. The probability mathematics here do not close. This is the calculation no one has published, the gap that official explanations step over without acknowledging. If we assume, as the institutional position requires, that the Dieppe cartographers were fabricating coastlines from fragmentary rumour without empirical measurement, then the placement of specific features becomes a statistical problem. Australia's coastline runs approximately 36,000 kilometres. Shark Bay, a distinctive indentation recognizable on any modern satellite image, occupies roughly 80 kilometres of that total. The probability of placing a random speculative bay at the correct latitude within 14 nautical miles of accuracy is, by simple calculation, approximately 1 in 450. That is a single feature on a single chart. The Dauphin map places the Cape Leeuwin bulge correctly. The Valad Atlas places Botany Bay Harbour correctly. The Rots Atlas places Shark Bay correctly. Even if we assume these cartographers had access to a common source rather than working independently, the question remains: how did that common source achieve such precision without systematic surveying? The official explanation requires us to accept either extraordinary coincidence or the existence of detailed prior knowledge. The outline keeps appearing where it should not appear, and neither random chance nor vague rumour can account for the pattern. No official response addresses this calculation directly. The academic literature on the Dieppe maps runs to thousands of pages, monographs, and journal articles and doctoral dissertations. But the probability question sits unexamined at the center of all of it. The gap everyone walks past because to acknowledge it would require explaining how the maps could be accurate without acknowledging that someone at some point before 1536 stood on those shores and measured them. The Portuguese keep no records of such expeditions. The official position is that they did not occur, but the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal along a meridian running through the Atlantic, and the Portuguese half included everything east of that line, which is to say, everything in the direction of Australia. Portuguese captains operating under royal charter had every incentive to explore eastward and no incentive to document what they found, because documentation meant sharing intelligence with rivals, meant diplomatic complications with Spain over whether the discovered lands fell on the Portuguese or Spanish side of the anti-meridian, meant the Casa de India bureaucracy, learning of territories the local captain preferred to exploit privately. The absence of records is not evidence of absence. The absence of records is exactly what you would expect from a maritime empire that treated cartographic intelligence as state secret and that punished the unauthorized copying of charts with death. The structural reason this question has not been settled is not conspiracy, it is funding. Australian academic archaeology operates on grants administered through institutions that have no category for pre-Cook European contact. The question falls between disciplines, too historical for geologists, too geological for historians, too archaeological for cartographers. A researcher proposing to survey the Houtman Abrolhos for Portuguese ceramic fragments older than 1616 would need to demonstrate in advance that such fragments probably exist, but the purpose of the survey would be to determine whether they exist. The circularity is obvious. You cannot get funding to look for something without evidence that it is there, but you cannot get evidence that it is there without looking. The institutional architecture filters the question out before it can be asked, not through suppression, but through categorical neglect, through the normal functioning of peer review in a system that rewards incremental advancement of established positions and penalizes speculative inquiry into questions that might embarrass national foundation narratives. The technology that could settle this exists now. Ground-penetrating radar has reached resolutions capable of identifying buried ceramic at depths of 2 meters in sandy soil. The Western Australian coast, from Shark Bay to the Eendracht landing site, contains dozens of natural harbours where a 16th century expedition would have careened ships and left debris. A systematic GPR survey of those harbours, combined with magnetometry to detect iron artifacts, would identify subsurface anomalies consistent with European material culture. If the survey found nothing, the question would close. If the survey found Portuguese ceramics datable to the early 1500s, the outline on those French charts would finally have an origin, a physical anchor in the soil that matched the cartographic anchor on the parchment. The survey would cost, by current estimates for similar projects, approximately 300,000 Australian dollars. That amount represents less than 1% of the annual archaeology budget administered through the Australian Research Council. No one has applied it. No one has proposed the project. The question remains exactly where it was when Alexander Dalrymple first noticed the discrepancies in 1786, and Matthew Flinders examined them again in 1802. The silence around these questions is not conspiracy. It is something far more mundane and far more difficult to address. It is structure. Academic careers in Australian archaeology are built on Aboriginal heritage studies, on the careful documentation of 60,000-year occupation patterns, on the politically and ethically vital work of recognizing Indigenous presence and protecting sacred sites. This work matters. It has transformed how Australia understands itself. It has corrected centuries of erasure, and it has, as an unintended consequence, created a categorical framework in which pre-colonial contact means one thing and one thing only: the relationship between European arrival and Indigenous displacement. Within that framework, a question about 17th century Dutch presence is not merely uninteresting. It is potentially dangerous. It suggests that the story of European contact began earlier, that the clean historical break of 1788 was preceded by something murkier, that the map of colonial responsibility might need to be redrawn. No funding body wants to redraw that map. No academic department wants to explain why they are investigating Dutch sailors instead of protecting rock art. No researcher at the beginning of their career wants to be known as the person who complicated the narrative. The pressure is not explicit. No one sends memos instructing scholars to avoid certain questions. The pressure is implicit, structural, ambient. It exists in the grant application forms that ask for significance to Indigenous heritage and have no checkbox for significance to European cartographic history. It exists in the peer review process where 3 anonymous readers, all trained in the same categorical assumptions, evaluate whether a proposed project fits the existing paradigm. It exists in the conference circuits where certain questions generate nods and other questions generate uncomfortable silences. The Portuguese hypothesis faces the same structural barrier, compounded by nationalism. Australian history, as currently taught and funded, begins with Dutch sighting in 1606, continues through British colonisation in 1788, and frames everything before as either Indigenous prehistory or European prelude. A Portuguese presence in the 1520s does not fit this timeline. It does not fit the available funding categories. It does not fit the existing museum exhibitions or the established academic careers built on the current chronology. To investigate it seriously would require not just money, but institutional permission. The kind of permission that comes only when senior figures in a field decide that a question is legitimate. Those senior figures built their careers within the existing framework. They have no professional incentive to destabilize it. And so the Dauphin map remains where it has always been: visible, available, reproducible in high resolution on a dozen different websites, studied by cartographic historians in Portugal and France, who have no stake in Australian academic politics, and entirely absent from the archaeological research agenda of the country it depicts. Consider what investigation would actually require. The technology exists. Ground-penetrating radar can locate buried structures and metal objects to a depth of several meters without disturbing the surface. The equipment costs roughly $40,000 to purchase, or $800 per day to rent. A systematic survey of the Abrolhos Islands, the area around Shark Bay, and the Kimberley coast, where Borden noted anomalous clearings, would require approximately 90 days of fieldwork. At standard academic pay rates for a research team of 4, 1 radar operator, 1 archaeologist, 2 field assistants, the total cost, including equipment rental, transport, accommodation, and analysis, would be approximately $270,000. Add the maritime archaeology component, systematic sonar survey of the approach channels to suspected landfall sites, the kind of work that located the Batavia wreckage in 1963, and the total rises to perhaps $450,000. That amount would fund the definitive survey. It would answer, one way or another, whether European artifacts exist at sites consistent with the Dauphin map's indications. It would either find the evidence or establish its absence. Either result would be valuable. Either result would close a question that has lingered since Alexander Dalrymple first examined the map in 1786 and noticed that the coastline it depicted did not match any known Portuguese voyage. For comparison, the Australian Research Council's Discovery Project scheme funded $268 million in humanities and social science research between 2018 and 2022. The project described above represents 0.17% of that allocation. The University of Western Australia's Archaeology Department has an annual operating budget of approximately $4.2 million. The project represents 10.7% of 1 year's budget, significant but not impossible. The Western Australian Museum's Maritime Archaeology Unit has previously conducted surveys of comparable scale for wreck sites of known historical significance. The Batavia excavation alone cost, in inflation-adjusted terms, over $7 million. The question is not whether the resources exist. The question is whether anyone with access to those resources considers this question worth asking. The structural answer is no, not because of suppression, not because of cover-up, but because academic systems are designed to reproduce existing knowledge, not to destabilize it. The incentives point toward refinement, toward adding detail to established narratives, toward the kind of incremental progress that generates reliable publications and stable careers. The incentives do not point toward questions that might require rewriting introductory textbooks, renegotiating museum exhibitions, or explaining to government ministers why the official history they learned in school was incomplete. This is not unique to Australian archaeology. It is the nature of institutional knowledge production everywhere. The questions that get answered are the questions that fit existing categories. The questions that do not fit become, over time, invisible. Not forbidden, not suppressed, simply absent from the agenda, generation after generation, until the absence itself becomes a kind of answer. We have not investigated, therefore there is nothing to find. We have not looked, therefore looking would be foolish. The Dauphin map sits in the Morgan Library, catalogue number MA3900, available for examination by any scholar who requests access. The coastline that does not match any documented Portuguese voyage runs from what would later be called the Kimberley, down through what would later be called Shark Bay, curving past what would later be called the Abrolhos Islands, continuing to the southern coast where the Great Australian Bight cuts into the continent. The rivers appear in the wrong places, until you account for sea level and tidal patterns that have shifted over 5 centuries. The mountains appear in the wrong places, until you notice that they correspond not to modern topography, but to the visual horizon as seen from a ship's deck at specific distances offshore. The map is wrong by every measure we normally apply. It is wrong in exactly the ways that a map made from direct observation, without modern surveying tools, by sailors who had no accurate way to determine longitude, would be wrong. 80% of the Western Australian coastline remains, in archaeological terms, unsurveyed. 80% of the ground where evidence might exist has never been examined with the tools that could find it. The trunks are there, the anomalous harbour names, the impossible coastline accuracy, the fresh water sources, the carved trees, the oral traditions, the astronomical observations, the Dauphin map itself. They have been there for 4 centuries, visible to anyone who thought to look. The forests they imply, the voyages, the landfalls, the sailors who walked that coast and charted those waters and perhaps died there, unknown and unrecorded, remain exactly where they have always been, in the space between what the map shows and what we have chosen to remember. And perhaps that space is where they belong. Perhaps there are questions that academic structures are not designed to answer, not because the answers are dangerous, but because the questions themselves do not fit the shape of institutional knowledge. Perhaps the Dauphin map is not a problem to be solved, but a reminder that the past is larger than the stories we tell about it, that the coastline we think we know was seen and charted and perhaps named by people whose records did not survive in the archives we chose to keep. Perhaps the map that does not exist is simply the map that exists in the wrong category, filed under anomaly instead of evidence, waiting for a researcher who has not yet been born, or a funding structure that has not yet been created, or a question that has not yet become permissible. Dalrymple noticed the discrepancies in 1786. Flinders noticed them in 1802. Major and Collingridge and Richardson noticed them across 2 centuries of careful scholarship. The discrepancies remain. Here is what we know for certain. A map exists that depicts a coastline that no documented voyage could have charted. The map is real. The coastline is accurate. The explanation is absent. And across that absent explanation, across the 400 years between possible Portuguese landfall and present Australian silence, stretches a question that we have not yet learned how to ask, not because we lack the words, but because we have not yet built the institutions capable of hearing the answer. The stubbed routes of unrecorded voyages remain visible along 8,000 kilometers of coast, waiting in the same patient silence that has always characterized the things we are not yet ready to see. In that silence, in the space between the map that exists and the history that does not acknowledge it, lies something larger than any single voyage or any single coastline. There lies the outer boundary of what we permit ourselves to know, not the edge of evidence, but the edge of permission, the categorical wall beyond which questions do not become conspiracy, but simply cease to be asked, cease to be funded, cease to be visible, until the absence itself becomes the only answer we are capable of giving. The map remains. The coastline remains. The silence, vast and structural and entirely of our own construction, remains. And in that silence, patient as geology, the evidence waits for the question we have not yet learned to ask.